So this video lecture is about The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde. This is one of my favorite plays, and there's so much stuff to say about Importance of Being Earnest. I am nowhere near going to cover all of the things that should ideally be covered in this. So I want to talk just about a couple of important things and a couple of important ideas in this. So Wilde himself, let's talk really quickly about Wilde. Wilde was one of the great figures of what we call transition English literature, which is the period from about the 1890s, late 1880s, up through World War I. So this is when we have a shift between the Victorians, or mid-Victorian, high Victorian, and when we get to modernist literature, which we'll discuss in the 20th century weeks. So Wilde is the spokesperson of this movement that we would call aestheticism. And you'll be able to sort of see the spelling of that in the lecture notes and stuff. Aestheticism is a variation on the philosophy of art for art's sake, that takes art as sort of the premise of constructing one's life. So Wilde was a living work of art. His clothing was very stylish. He was at the height of fashion. His conversation was supposedly, he was a master of conversation. He was witty, he was urbane, he was clever, and he presented himself as though everything were a very sort of polished performance about himself. And he does this as well with the characters in his plays. So Wilde wrote in a wide range of genres. He wrote poetry, he wrote essays, he wrote fiction. Probably his most famous novel is The Picture of Dorian Gray. But his most famous play is The Importance of Being Earnest. He wrote, I think, 5 plays in the mid-1890s, early 1890s, and The Importance of Being Earnest is his masterpiece. This is what we call a comedy of manners, which is a genre that develops really during the Restoration period in the 1660s and 1670s. Basically, what a comedy of manners is all about is that it takes the way that people interact, the way that people perform, and it takes social norms, and it exposes them as already being pretty laughable. So, we have here a series of characters who are caricatures of Victorian values, styles, mores, and so on and so on. So we take, for instance, Lady Bracknell, one of the greatest characters in the history of the stage. Lady Bracknell is so much fun because she's so over the top. Almost any piece of Lady Bracknell's dialogue is funny, not because she herself is actually funny, but because of the way that this character would be delivered, the way that this character would be performed. So, I mean, all of the characters in The Importance of Being Earnest are supposed to perform, or all of the actors in The Importance of Being Earnest are supposed to perform their parts very seriously, despite the sort of triviality of so much of the things, so many of the things that are going on. So despite the triviality, despite the absurdity of so much of what's going on. And Lady Bracknell is a great example of this, because the part is written in such a way that she can have this seriousness about her and this dignity about her that becomes laughable. So I've picked really a random passage here from Lady Bracknell. This is in Act 1, page 1743. Gwendolen says, "I am engaged to Mr. Worthing, Mamma." And Lady Bracknell says, "Pardon me, you are not engaged to anyone. When you do become engaged to someone, I or your father, should his health permit him, will inform you of the fact. An engagement should come on a young girl as a surprise, pleasant or unpleasant, as the case may be. It is hardly a matter that she can be allowed to arrange for herself. And now I have a few questions to put to you, Mr. Worthing. While I am making these inquiries, you, Gwendolen, will wait for me below in the carriage." So, we have this sort of elevated dignity and this sort of complexity of ideas in a character like Lady Bracknell, but it also becomes laughable. So, and a lot of this is because of Wilde's wit. So, wit is this idea of sort of clever speech, linguistic play, irony, and it's hilarious. Even on the page, she's a funny character. But all of the characters are like this. I mean, all of these characters say these sort of trivial things as though they're these sort of great philosophic pronouncements. All of the characters are absurd and bizarre in their own way. I mean, Algernon with his sort of devotion to eating, and this constant need of his to interrupt the plot and interrupt fairly serious things that are going on by having a sandwich or some muffins or something like this. And then, but I mean, so beyond the characters being funny, so because I mean, I'm trying to think of how to transition here. So, in theater, in drama, a comedy is not just something that's funny. That's not sort of the criteria for a comedy. A comedy is something that has a distinctive structure, and it has a distinctive set of characteristics that go into it. And Wilde uses the vast majority of these. So some of the things that go into a classic dramatic comedy would be things like mistaken identities, things like lovers separated, things like a happy ending, things like absurd coincidences and absurd connections and things like this. And so Wilde is using all of these components of classical comedy to create the importance of being earnest. I mean, we'll take, for instance, mistaken identities. This is what a lot of the plot revolves around. Jack Worthing, of course, plays Ernest when he's in town and Jack when he's in the country. So we have this element of mistaken identities. Algernon comes to the country under the name of Ernest, and he sort of performs the character of Ernest there, and it's later revealed that to Cecily, who's the only one he really fools, that he was in fact Algernon Moncrief. So we have this series of sort of mistaken identities largely circulating around the name of Ernest. And then, as it turns out, at the end of the play, hopefully you've all read to the end of the play before you watch this video, because I'm about to spoil it if you haven't. At the end of the play, it turns out that Jack was not actually lying, that he really was Ernest. And we find this out because he is, in fact, the long-lost brother of Algernon. And so we get here at the very end of the play, this is 1776, Jack says, "Then I was christened. That is settled. Now what name was I given? Let me know the worst." And Lady Bracknell says, "Being the eldest son, you were naturally christened after your father." And Jack says, irritably, "Yes, but what was my father's Christian name?" And Lady Bracknell says meditatively, "I cannot at the present moment recall what the General's Christian name was, but I have no doubt he had one. He was eccentric, I admit, but only in later years. and that was the result of the Indian climate, and marriage, and indigestion, and other things of that kind. Jack says, Algy, can't you recollect what your father's Christian name was? Algernon says, my boy, this is actually longer than I intended it to be, but Algernon says, my dear boy, we were never even on speaking terms. He died before I was a year old. Alright, let's go ahead here. Alright, well, I'll actually stop reading there, but I'll leave you with this. The upshot of it is that Jack Worthing's name is actually Ernest Moncrief, which they have to go to the army records to discover, because neither Lady Bracknell nor Algernon remember the general's name. And so we have ultimately this mistaken identity, where Jack has sort of mistaken his own identity, but he has mistaken that identity for the identity that he chose to perform. So he becomes Ernest, which he had already always been. This is a bit confusing, but it actually makes perfect sense with the plot of the play. So Jack had come to London, come to town, pretending to be a fellow named Ernest, so that he could get away from his life in the country. And at the end of the play, we find out that he didn't actually know who he was by birth, and he had been raised by someone other than his parents. And so the upshot is, through this series of coincidences, he is actually Algernon's brother, named Ernest. So we get, again, this sort of element of classical comedy where we have these mistakes and these reversals, and it's all very absurd. Like, the coincidences are too much to be believed, and that's what makes it so funny. And then ultimately, at the end of the play, we have, as at the end of any good dramatic comedy, we have everyone getting married. So, Jack and Gwendolen, or Ernest and Gwendolen, Algernon and Cecily, Miss Prism and Dr. Cheshire, everyone is getting married. And we can make the legitimate case that these marriages don't feel like they have a solid basis. And so, as with so many comedies, we can read the ending as actually a satire on its own happiness.